So if you've heard of Jesus, you probably know about one of his famous teachings called the Golden Rule. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. And this, actually, is a restatement of something else that Jesus said, that the meaning of life is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's really beautiful, but what does he mean exactly by the word love? It's an unclear word in English, because you can love your mom and you can love pizza. And if the word love means the same thing in both of those cases, your mom's gonna feel real bad. So what did Jesus mean in his language? Well, first of all, this love your neighbor phrase is a quotation from the Hebrew scriptures, where the word for love is ahava. However, the language Jesus spoke and taught in from day to day, it was a cousin language of Hebrew, that is Aramaic, in which the word for love is rachma. But then, as Jesus' followers spread his teachings around the world, they translated them into Greek, using the word agape. But here's what's fascinating. The earliest followers of Jesus, who wrote the books of the New Testament in Greek, they didn't learn the meaning of agape by looking it up in ancient dictionaries. Rather, they looked to the teachings of Jesus and the story of his life to redefine their very concept of love. So one time, Jesus was asked about the most important command in the Jewish scriptures. And he first quoted from the ancient prayer in the Torah called the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart. So love for God is the most important thing. But then Jesus quickly followed up by saying another command from the Torah was also the most important, to love your neighbor as yourself. So which is the most important, loving God or loving your neighbor? Jesus' answer is yes. To ask the question means you don't get his point. For Jesus, they are two sides of the same coin. Your love for God will be expressed by your love for people, and vice versa, they're inseparable. And so this makes it clear that for Jesus, agape love is not primarily a feeling for someone else that happens to you, like our phrase, I fell in love. For Jesus, love is action. It's a choice that you make to seek the well-being of people other than yourself. Jesus also went on to teach that genuine love for God and others means seeking people's well-being without expecting anything in return, especially from people who are in difficult situations, who can't repay you even if they wanted to. According to Jesus, this kind of generous love reflects the very heartbeat of God. And he took this even further. Jesus said that the ultimate standard of authentic love is how well you treat the person that you can't stand. Or in his words, you shall love your enemy and do good to them, expecting nothing in return. For Jesus, this kind of enemy-embracing love imitates the very character of God himself. Now, we wouldn't be talking about Jesus still today if he had only said things like love your enemy. This is how he actually lived. Jesus was constantly helping and serving the people around him in very practical and tangible ways. And he consistently moved towards poor and hurting people who couldn't benefit him in return. He showed love for the forgotten ones, the people who usually fall through the cracks. And when Jesus eventually marched into Jerusalem, he made himself an enemy of the leaders of his people by accusing them of hypocrisy and corruption. But then instead of attacking his enemies to overthrow them, he allowed them to kill him. Jesus died for the selfishness and corruption of his enemies because he loved them. After Easter morning, Jesus and then his followers claimed that it was the power of God's love for the world that was revealed in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. As the Apostle Paul put it, God demonstrated his own agape for us in this: while we were still sinners, the Messiah died for us. Or in the words of the Apostle John, God's own agape was revealed when he sent his one and only Son into the world so that through him we could have life. And for John, then, this leads naturally to the conclusion, beloved ones, if that's how God has loved us, then we ought to show love for one another. So Christian faith involves trusting that at the center of the universe is a being overflowing with love for his world, which means that the purpose of human existence is to receive this love that has come to us in Jesus and then to give it back out to others, creating an ecosystem of others-focused, self-giving love. And that's the New Testament meaning of agape love.
During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 servant wives and his 11 sons and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began. to break. When the man saw that he could not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Even to this day, people of Israel don't eat the tendon near the hip socket because of what happened that night when the man strained the tendon of Jacob's hip.
What a weird story. Don't you think? Isn't that weird? Found so many things that are weird in the Old Testament are pointing to something very profound in the New. And that's what we're going to discover today. Now, if you could sum up what the whole Bible is about, it might kind of look like this. How can sinful humans have a friendship with a holy God? How is that going to work exactly? And we get 66 books of how that plays out. As we continue on in our Good News Everywhere series, we get to this wrestling match that Jacob has. Now, I realize at this point some of you haven't listened to the last few messages, so you might not know who is this Jacob guy. Jacob comes from the line of Abraham. This was the line of people that God promised, said, "I'm going to bless the whole world through your line." And Jacob was a twin, and even though he was younger than his older twin brother, God said he would continue the line of the Messiah through the younger, not the older, which was very weird at that time. So he tricked his family into getting this blessing so he could get the lion's share of the inheritance. And then he went off and lived with his uncle for a while. Eventually he got married, and then he worked for his uncle for a while. Then we read this in Genesis 31:3. It says, "Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your father and grandfather and to your relatives there, and I will be with you.'" So he gets the time to go home kind of thing. So you got to remember now, just put yourself in Jacob's shoes for a second. He did not leave his family in a very good state, right? I mean, he betrayed his brother and his dad, and now God is saying, "You need to go back." Well, this is, I can't even imagine the anxiety that must create. So, typical, though, of Jacob, he even leaves in a sneaky way. If you read the story, he packs up all his family and his kids and his belongings so his uncle doesn't know, and woo-hoo, off he goes without him knowing. And as he gets close to his home, his birth home, he sends a message to his brother. And it's quite diplomatic. It's not one of those, "Hey, I'm the long-lost king of the family, it's time to get what's coming to me." You know, not like one of those messages. He was smarter than that. So he sends his brother his message, and he says, "You're my master, I'm your servant." He lays it on pretty thick. And how does his brother respond in kind? He sends an army of 400 people. How would you feel now? Are you freaking out a little bit? I would be. So then, because he's in crisis, Jacob does what most of us do, or many of us do in crisis. What does he do? He prays. And the first thing he prays, I love this. If you read his prayer, it says, "God, this was your idea. I'm only here because you said so. Just reminding you, no problems." And then he thanks God for all that he's done, and he reminds God that, "Just remember, you said you'd bless my family line, so me dying right now may not help. Just thought I'd let you know." Then he starts sending waves of gifts ahead to his brother. Goats, rams, cattle, donkeys, and all that sort of thing. And he says, and for each Santa Claus he sends ahead with these gifts. See how I threw Christmas in there? Sends these, these Santa Claus. He said, here's what you must say. You must reply when asked, what is this all about? They belong to your servant Jacob, but they are a gift for his master Esau. Look, he is coming right behind us. So he's greasing the wheels, right? It's pretty shrewd, I'd say. Pretty smart. Now, we get to the match. And that's where I really want to land today. Because Jacob is left alone in the camp. And this will become what I think is the most important night in Jacob's life. And let's just go through it again. A man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob. The man told him, from now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Now, this MMA moment came out of nowhere. It just lands in the middle of the text and expects you to figure it out, and expects me to figure it out. Who is this man? This man just comes out of nowhere. So here's Jacob in his tent all alone. The next thing he knows, he's in a wrestling match. The weirdness just continues in this. So who is this man? Well, you can find out later in the story, this is no one other than Jesus himself. The physical, the one who reveals God physically to us. This is Jesus. And we get 3 lessons in this story. There's probably more, but we're going to stick to 3. Oh, I love this story. The more I dug into this, the more I love this story. And I was sitting here an hour before the service started, and I'm just writing stuff down. I'm hoping I'm going to get it all to you here, but this is a really cool story. So 3 lessons. First of all, a relationship with God is ultimately personal. Now, I have spoken before about the importance of being part of a church family like NAC. The richness of how God reveals himself in different ways through other people. And we get a bigger sense of God by being around his people. So it's really important that we're part of a church family. But Jacob is alone when Jesus shows up. No wife, no children, no belongings, no video games, no news channel, no hobbies, no chores. It's just him and God. And why is this important? Why is this an important detail? Because many of us grew up belonging to a church. We sang songs together. We went to events together. We prayed prayers together. Went to baptisms together. Heard many messages together. And we felt a sense of community together, just like any other faith or any other club. And then something happened. Maybe we moved away from our home church, and suddenly our faith felt cold and distant and unrecognizable. Maybe our faith community, we were part of a church community because of our children or because of our spouse. And when our children move away or our spouse dies or our friends no longer come, we find that our faith dwindles. I've seen this time and time again. People who've been coming to church for decades, their children move away, their spouse dies, and they stop coming. Why is that? Why is it? One of the reasons could very well be that their faith was not personal. It was corporate. It was only corporate. They didn't ever wrestle alone with God. If you had asked Jacob in the series of his life what his biggest problems were, he'd say, well, first of all, my biggest problem was my dad. My dad's not going to bless me. Then my problem is my brother. He's trying to take the blessing away from me. And then his next problem would be, well, I'm lonely. I need a wife. That's his problem. Then his next problem is his uncle. And in every situation, here's the lesson for us. In every situation, Jacob was really wrestling with God. Just like you and I, we think our problems are this situation or that person. The bottom end of it all is we are wrestling with God. All our angst, all our troubles boil down to the question, can I trust God? Jacob asks twice for Jesus' name. Did you notice that? And Jesus never answers. He basically kind of gives the impression, you know who I am. You already know. Why do I need to say it? Many of us enjoy a relationship with God that includes maybe our spouse, maybe our family, our church, our pastor. But there'll come a time in your life, if it hasn't happened already, where you'll be alone. When you're being wheeled into that surgery, you'll be alone. When you bury your spouse, and half of us will, you may find yourself alone. One of the things that seniors have told me, the older you get, the more alone you become. Your friends all die off. You become more and more alone. And if your faith is not personal, if you have not had a personal encounter with Christ, your faith will begin to diminish and dwindle. It will vaporize when the crowd is gone because of this. A crowd enhances your faith, but it cannot create it. See? Your faith has to be personal. You have to have a personal encounter with God. All right. That was the first thing we find. Jacob was alone when he had this encounter, and it changed his life, by the way. Like I said, this is the most important event in Jacob's life, in my opinion. So, the first lesson was a relationship with God is ultimately personal. Secondly, change comes in desperation. Jacob craved blessing. First, he craved blessing from his dad. Then he wanted the blessing of a wife. And then he wanted the blessing of wealth. He's always looking for value, for affirmation. He wants someone to tell him, Jacob, you matter. Does this not sound familiar to all of us? Don't we all want to matter? We want our lives to count for something. We want to be important. And often idols will form around the things we think that we need to be okay. It could be winning the lottery. Oh, if I'd only win the lottery, I'd be okay. Or if I could only get married. Or if I could only lose that 20 pounds. Or if I could only travel. Or if I could only get that degree. Or have more friends or more family. And then we see how really out of control we are. Did you notice in the story? You know, Jacob is wrestling Jesus, and Jesus is matching him move for move for move. It looks like a pretty even match, right? And then Jesus just touches him. And his hip is shot for the rest of his life. This is a power move, right? Like, just so you know, Jacob, who's really more powerful here, touch. There you are. This shows how out of control we really are. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Finally, when he realizes he cannot fight God and win, he realizes there's only one thing he needs. There's only one blessing that he needs. It's not the blessing of his dad. It's not the blessing of his wife. It's not the blessing of wealth. It is God. He needs the blessing of God more than anything else. And he goes from wrestling, did you notice? He goes from wrestling, fighting, to hanging on. Now he's hanging on and he won't let go. I won't let go until you bless me. I won't let go until you approve of me. That's all that mattered. How cool is that? There's only one blessing in our lives that is needed. Only one supreme relationship. Let me ask you, is this relationship supreme to you? Or are you still looking for blessings from others, just like Jacob had been all his life? In the book Finding God by Larry Crabb, he opens with a dedication to Dr. Charles Smith. I don't know who Dr. Charles Smith is. He was a mentor and friend of Larry Crabb. But this is what he said in his dedication. Listen to these words. He said, I dedicate this to Dr. Charles Smith, who prayed that God would let his cancer come back if it meant getting nearer to God. And in the last year, he found God in a way he never had found him before, just before he died of cancer. What does that mean? Dr. Charles Smith realized there was a relationship above every relationship. That he said, I would rather have cancer and die if that means I could know you more. If I could experience you more. You are the ultimate relationship. The ultimate blessing comes from you. Can you imagine praying that prayer? Most of us would wrestle with God and say, God, heal me of this cancer. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's wrong. Do that. God wants to hear the desires of our heart. But can you imagine having the faith that says, you know what? If having cancer means I can get closer to you, more desperate for you, then bring it on. Now that's faith. That's beauty. That's seeking the beauty of God. Change often comes in this desperation when God is our need, our home, the beauty that we seek, the rest that we desire, the love that we crave, the affirmation we long for, and the blessing that we've been searching for. When all we want to hear in our lives is, well done, good and faithful servant. That's it. It's the biggest thing that we want to hear. And we will hang on to God until we hear that blessing. Well done, and good and faithful servant. So, we get to our third lesson. Victory comes in losing. Weeks ago, I did something really stupid as a pastor, and I talked about, from a woman's perspective, do you remember this? What it takes to win as a woman in society. Now, fortunately for me, many of you told me I hit it pretty close. I'm going to show the other side of the coin today, which is the expectations on men. Men are expected to be strong, which the translation of that is emotionless. We are all called to be Spocks, and we are trained in this. You know, just it was a couple weeks ago, Jen and I walked into a restaurant, and I overheard just this conversation going on. It was, I think, a dad and a couple of, very early teens, maybe preteen boys. And one of the preteen boys reached out and hugged his friend. And his dad scolded him. Yeah, and actually said something that was, I won't say what he said, but it was meant to shame him. Because boys don't show emotion. Boys don't do that. You need to be strong and emotionless. And in exchange, boys are given the crippling fear of looking weak. That's their gift. They're afraid all their lives of looking weak. And many of us men in this room have that. We don't want to look weak. Curious. Here's the curious part. The weirdest part in this story for me comes in verse 25. I don't know how many of you caught it, but this is what it says. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. What in the world does that mean? And if you look at the NIV, it says not would not, but could not. He could not win the match. What is going on here? What does it mean, Jesus could not win the match? Jesus didn't have his spinach that morning or something? Like, what is happening here? This makes no sense. And now we're getting closer to the question, how can sinful humans have a friendship with a holy God? Could God have won a power match with Jacob easily and showed it? Touch. Right? Remember that? And yet, Jesus claimed that Jacob won the match. What is going on? Well, the fact is, God could overpower any one of us at any time. It's not hard. He could prove his power. He could prove his existence. He could bowl us over with thunderclaps and volcanic eruptions and have our name written in plaid in the sky. He could show us his power. He could show us his existence. No problem. But he's showing us a kingdom value, which is victory is secured by losing. Victory is secured by losing. And Jesus took on the form, did you catch that? Jesus took on the form of Jacob's equal. Wrestling, move for move. Victory is secured by losing. How do we know this? Because on Good Friday, no one would have claimed Jesus a victor. At 6 o'clock that evening, his disciples were in despair, hiding. Their hero had been conquered. The one that they had worshipped was dead. He would have been called a loser that day. Weak, vulnerable, killable, despised, rejected. But the New Testament authors had a very different take on what life was like at 6 o'clock the evening of Good Friday. We read this. Jesus disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. He shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross. This is amazing. Jesus won by losing. It says he disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. Now, let me get all Star Wars on you, okay? It seems like an appropriate thing to do. There's a scene. For those of you who are not Star Wars fans, I'll try to put this in terms you'll get. You may be familiar with the character Darth Vader. In Rogue One, there is a scene where Vader is showing his power. And all he does is he clenches his fist, and the blasters just fly out of the hands of the Rebel Alliance. You remember this? Nod your head if you... Okay, good. All right. So, thank you, Wayne. You're my buddy. He's showing his power. And all Vader had to do was go like this, and they were disarmed. Do you know that's the same thing Jesus did to the spiritual rulers and authorities, but he didn't do it with a display of power. He did it with a display of weakness. He went to the cross, and all the spiritual powers that are trying to rule your life were disarmed. How cool is that? That's what this means. Jesus disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. The blasters just fell out of their hands. You know, in all the mythical stories that you can read about in Europe, Mediterranean, and Asia, the heroes of stories are always physically strong, and they're out to gain something. And J.R.R. Tolkien knew this, the Oxford professor. But instead of writing in Lord of the Rings, instead of writing about a strong hero, he wrote about a victory through sacrifice, through weakness, through giving your life to others. And to get more geeky with you, this is what the elf Elrond said to Frodo. He said, I think that this task of destroying this ring, this task is appointed to you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of all the wise could have foreseen it? These tiny little hobbits are going to change the world. Things are changed through weakness, not through displays of great power, but often through defeat. How can sinful humans have a friendship with a holy God? Through weakness, through defeat, through the cross. This was the only way to see God's face and be spared. Did you notice Jacob, in the story, he's amazed. He came face to face with a holy God, but didn't die. And the only way that that could happen was that Jesus took on the form of weakness. A human. Jacob was severely outmatched, but was declared the winner. This is grace. This is grace. You didn't earn this victory, Jacob. I gave it to you. I could have overpowered you at any time. I'm giving you the victory. And what was God trying to win? God didn't want to win a show of power. That'd have been easy. What did he want to win? In the story, he wanted to win Jacob. In your story, he wants to win you. And he could overpower you at any time. But he comes to you in weakness. He comes to you on the cross, defeated, and yet gaining great victory. He wants to win you the ultimate prize to him. He doesn't want to show his power. He wants to show compassion. You are his prized possession. He wants to win a relationship with you and with me. And why does it say in the text that Jesus could not win or would not win? It really doesn't matter which one is translated. The idea is the same. Because God could not or would not win a power match and still get his prize, which is you. I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. This is grace. You know, in our culture, the powerful win. In the kingdom, the powerless and the weak win. In losing, God was out to win you. In the kingdom, the weak and repentant are declared by God. Declared by God to be the ultimate winners. You know what he calls us in the New Testament? Even though he could totally overpower us, you know what he calls us? He calls us rulers, royalty, priests, sons and daughters, his prized possession. Those are just some of the things over here that's declared about you, his followers, the moment you give your life to Christ. The kingdom is not filled with those who try to show they are superior to God, but those who admit they are not. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. But if I could sum up this story in very clear terms, in case you're a little lost, what to do. Admit that you are wrestling with God. All that rumbles in our soul is ultimately wrestling with God. We are trying to answer the question, can I trust you? We may think that we are wrestling with our work situation, or our family, or our spouse, or this Christmas dinner that we're looking at, coming up in a week. We think we're wrestling with things and with people, but ultimately, everything comes back to a wrestling match with God. And what to do? We need to concede defeat. Because we must understand that we cannot control God. And as I've said before, you know how we try to control God? You know how we try to overpower God? We get in this power match with God. There's two ways to try to overpower God that human beings try. You know what they are? First of all, we rebel against God. You're not going to have any power over me. I'm going to do whatever I want. That's the first way. You're not going to overpower me. You're not going to tell me what to do. You ever heard someone say that? Ever thought that? Yeah, me too. Second thing is, you know how else we try to control God? Through religion. I'm going to do everything you want me to do, so that I'm going to back you into a corner and you have to do what I ask. You'll owe me because I do everything right. Rebellion or religion, we are wrestling with God. The only way to really win is to concede defeat. It wasn't until Jacob realized he was way outmatched, he was not going to win, that things began to change. Finally, number 3, desire only God's approval. Those who win in life are those who only want God's approval and God's blessing. I will not let you go. I will not let you go until you bless me. I will not let you go until you bless me. Jacob stopped fighting when he realized he couldn't win, when he couldn't control God. And that's when he wanted God's approval alone. Jesus gained us by losing at the cross, and Jacob gained God by giving up the fight. Jesus wrestled with Jacob and could have won, but chose to lose so that Jacob could win by having a relationship with God. And Jacob was never the same. I love that little bit about he was reminded of this event for the rest of his life. And some of you have little reminders because you've come to the same place where you realized that all your fighting with rebellion or religion is not going to overpower God. And it's only when you surrender and you go, I just have to have you declare me the victor. That's all I've got. Jesus went to the cross. He lost so we could win, so we could have our sins forgiven. So the power of idolatry, all those powers are disarmed in our lives. Where we are free to serve and free to love and free to give, free to be His priests and reflect His beauty to the world. These are the things that He freed us to. The cross is a symbol of the value of the kingdom. That winning comes from losing. Strength is found in weakness, and power is gained by giving it up. Power is found in weakness, in sacrifice, in service. And the good news for us is that God loved us so much that He was willing to do that. You see, when you love someone, you are willing to lose for them. Greater love has no one than this, that He laid down His life for His friends. Winning comes from losing. I want you to reflect on these questions. Is my faith personal? Or am I here because of my spouse or my kids? Or because I have good friends here? Or because I've always attended here? Is my faith personal? Second, do I want only God's blessing? All other things can drop away. I will hang on to God and I will not leave until He blesses me. And finally, am I still fighting God? Or do I believe God declared me the victor? Are we still fighting God with our religion or with our rebellion? Is it time to realize we are greatly outmatched?